first webinar with Michael Kugelman. I hope you all already know Michael Kugelman. He is a South Asia expert at Wilson Center. He is Deputy Director of South Asia Program and a Senior Associate in the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He is responsible for research, programming, and publications on the region. His main specialty is Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, and US relations with each of them. Mr. Kugelman writes monthly columns for Foreign Policy South Asia channel. He also contributes regular pieces to the Wall Street Journal's think tank blog. That's in brief to tell about Michael Kugelman from me. If you want to know more about him, you can visit wilsoncenter.org/person/Michael-Kugelman. Michael, how are you today in this special pandemic time?
Very well, thank you, and thank you for having me, Kausar. I have to say that I admire your work and your passion for the causes of democracy and human rights that you promote in Bangladesh and beyond. So it's great to be here with you. I've been looking forward to talking with you. But I am well, thanks, and hope that you are coping okay as well in these very difficult times.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for your kind comments on our works, and I must say it is a recognition for us, for Archer Blood Center for Civil and Political Rights, and you are one of our advocate and one of our friends from since the beginning of our work. So, as we have organized a topic to discuss today, for the viewers, our topic is UAE and Bahrain's recognition of Israel and what does it mean for South Asia. We'll be talking with a special focus on Bangladesh. So at this moment, at the very beginning, I would like to invite Michael to talk elaborately what he wants to talk about these.
Sure. Thank you. I'll say some things, and then I'll look forward to any questions that you have. I'll just provide a bit of background here on the deal between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Israel, really from the perspective of U.S. thinking, U.S. policy. Israel, as we all know, has long been a focus of the Trump administration. It has always been a focus of successive U.S. governments. Israel, of course, is one of America's top allies. And while the relationship between the U.S. and Israel did flounder a bit in the Obama years, it's really been strengthened in a big way in the Trump years. And in fact, the U.S. relationship with Israel is really, I would say, is one of the very few key U.S. bilateral partnerships that has not suffered in the Trump era. Its relationship, the U.S. relationship with Israel, with India is one of the only others. So Israel has really been a huge focus for the Trump administration, and the advisors that Trump, the very small number of advisors that Trump respects the most, people like Jared Kushner, they've had a laser-like focus on Israel. From the issue of changing the location of the U.S. embassy to pursuing a peace deal with the Palestinians. The peace deal with the Palestinians, not surprisingly, didn't work out well. Basically, what I was saying is that Israel has always been a key focus for U.S. policy, particularly with the current administration, where the top advisors, the very few top advisors that Trump actually listens to and pays attention to, they've been very fixated on the Israel issue. And there had been an effort to pursue to broker a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. Not surprisingly, that did not work out well. So the Trump administration then turned its attention to other ways that it could make some big bang moves with Israel in the region, and that led to the chain of events that resulted in the Israel-UAE deal. There are several factors at play, I would argue, that have driven this move. And I would argue that they are more tied to U.S. domestic politics than to foreign policy. So certainly the administration is keen to have Israel enjoy more normalized relationships in the Middle East and to integrate Israel into the Middle East in an effort to create more regional stability and also to undercut Tehran, which has no interest in reconciling with Israel and faces the prospect of several of its Saudi-aligned Arab rivals making peace with Israel. But I think it's important to look at what's playing out in the US. Trump, of course, is a deal maker. That's how he likes to project himself. A businessman who really relishes the art of the deal. Trump has faced so many scandals and crises as president that there's really a desire on his part to sharpen perceptions of him as someone who knows how to get things done and serve US interests. In this regard, the Israel deal is just what the doctor ordered. And in addition, with the US election fast approaching, it's of course just a month away, Trump is arguably more vulnerable now than he has been at any other point during his presidency because of his poor response to the pandemic, because of the economic crisis that's emerged from that, because of the social racial tensions in the US, because Trump is more vulnerable than at any point during his presidency, and because the election is so close, there's a particularly strong incentive from within the administration to get some type of quick win, to get a deal like this, the Israel-UAE deal, the Israel-Bahrain deals, and the administration hopes to get others like them. And this may overstate the interest that U.S. voters take in foreign affairs, and many Americans, including Trump's core Republican base, they really don't pay any mind to foreign affairs, and they may not even be aware of a new deal involving Israel and the UAE. One exception may be Christian conservatives in the US within Trump's political base that are strongly pro-Israel and pay a lot of attention to what Israel is up to. But in my view, there's a strong domestic political motivation that has fueled the US pursuit of this Israel deal. So that brings me to the question of, could this really be a step toward peace? I know that's something that you wanted me to address, and with any luck, you'll soon be back with me so that we can discuss this together. As I said before, I think that for the Trump administration, the goal with this agreement with Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain and hopefully other countries too, is to normalize Israel's relations with former rivals in a way that there could be more broader stability and peace in the broader region. Now, let's be quite honest. At the end of it, was the UAE really a big threat to Israel? Was there any type of threat of a war between Israel and the UAE, or Israel and Bahrain for that matter? No. So you could argue that this is really the low-hanging fruit, that Israel's been able to get peace deals with two countries that had been rivals of Israel, but that shouldn't be mistaken for the likes of a Saudi Arabia or countries like that have really been, that are powerful countries and key regional players. So I think it's good that Israel has a theoretically normalized ties with Bahrain and UAE now, but I think you need to look at other countries like Iran, for example, which are really like the key. Iran and Saudi Arabia, of course, are the key regional players, are the most powerful countries in the Middle East. And really, they're Israel's top two rivals, or its most dangerous rivals. Obviously, or not obviously, I think it's unlikely to expect any type of peace deal between Israel and Iran anytime soon. Saudi Arabia is a different case, though. I think that for the Trump administration, one of the objectives of this deal, of pursuing these deals between Israel and these Gulf Arab states, is to try to slowly give Saudi Arabia a strong incentive to sign on as well. These countries that have been normalizing ties with Israel in recent weeks are closely aligned with Saudi Arabia. They are Sunni Gulf Arab allies. And I think that for the US, and by extension for the UAE and Bahrain and even Saudi Arabia, the idea is to undercut Iran's interest by getting all of these rivals of Iran to sign on to new deals with Israel, Iran's top rival. And with the hope that eventually Saudi Arabia could have a deal with Israel too. But I think there's a long way to go before that can happen. Now, the other broader issue here, it relates to regional stability. But we have to look at the broader geopolitical picture, the regional picture here. And that's very important. I was saying before that for the US, one of the objectives of brokering these Israel-UAE deals and Israel-Bahrain deals is to get allies of the Saudis on Iran's side to try to undercut their collective rival, Iran. Basically, the idea is to get as many countries as possible in the region with normalized relations with Israel to put Iran, everyone's rival, on the defensive. But what this is going to do, in effect, is deepen, heighten the already fiery and frenzied rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is very significant for the region and could certainly have destabilizing implications for the region. Very similar to what happened earlier this year when the U.S. decided to assassinate Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. That was a move that the Saudis are probably very happy about. The Israelis are certainly happy about it. Obviously, it made U.S.-Iran relations even worse than they'd already been, but it sharpened the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Given that that rivalry had been heightened and sharpened so much, then you have the second Big Bang event, so to speak, where you have Israel signing new deals, new peace agreements with Iranian rivals in the region, the UAE and Bahrain. So I think that's something to worry about. In terms of implications for South Asia and Bangladesh, implications of these deals between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain, Pakistan has never had formal ties to Israel. It could face some uncomfortable questions. What do I mean by that? Well, soon after the yanking of the UAE-Israel deal, some commentators have wondered if Pakistan could follow the UAE's lead. Prime Minister Imran Khan, though, really very quickly squashed such speculation. He reasserted that Pakistan's longstanding position is that it will not normalize ties with Israel until there is a two-state solution in which the Palestinians agree. And indeed, it's a remote prospect for various reasons, but it's notable that several senior Pakistani leaders in recent times, including Pervez Musharraf, have called for better ties with Israel. Back in 2005, it's easy to forget this. 15 years ago, not too long ago, in Turkey, Israeli and Pakistani foreign ministers met. Pakistani-Israeli relationship. Let me backtrack a bit. 15 years ago in Turkey, Israeli and Pakistani foreign ministers met publicly for the first time. There's been some covert cooperation, in fact, between the two countries in previous decades. The Pakistan-Israel relationship is complex, it's sensitive. Islamabad likely prefers that questions about it stay out of the public sphere, and yet the UAE-Israel deal could invite the very questions Pakistan would much rather avoid. Second implication for South Asia of these Israeli deals is that, as I suggested before, it could throw more weight on the fire, throw more fuel on the fire of an already raging Saudi Arabia-Iran rivalry that casts a deep shadow across Pakistan, given its relations with both countries, and especially amid the recent Pakistan-Saudi Arabia spat over Kashmir, and amid the new agreement between India and China, which suggests that Islamabad, following its Chinese allies' lead, may edge a bit closer to Iran. The UAE-Iran deal, by driving Riyadh and Tehran further apart, could give the Saudis and Iranians greater incentives to pressure Pakistan to help them pursue their respective regional interests. Now, New Delhi, India has a friendly and growing relationship with Israel, and it tends not to get dragged into the Iran-Saudi Arabia rivalry because, unlike Pakistan, it does not have very deep or very poor relations with either country. But with New Delhi trying to scale up its relations with countries across the Middle East, the rivalry between the region's two most consequential players other than Israel will be difficult to avoid. The UAE-Israel deal risks further undermining India's already floundering relationship with Iran, a key commercial and especially energy partner for New Delhi, until U.S. sanctions in recent years took their toll and began to hamper India's ability to do business with Iran. Now, the UAE-Israel deal and the Bahrain-Israel deal will certainly deliver another blow to U.S.-Iran relations. It ensures, especially if the Trump administration returns to power, the continuation of harsh U.S. sanctions on Iran that in recent years have compelled India, a close, growing partner of Washington's, to scale down its energy imports from Tehran, formerly one of New Delhi's top foreign suppliers. And compounding all of this is the Iran-China agreement, which may compel Tehran to invite Beijing instead of New Delhi to develop the Chabahar port in southern Iran, originally part of a wider envisioned transport corridor project involving India, Iran, and Afghanistan. Bottom line is that the Soleimani killing, which I mentioned earlier, compounded now by the India, UAE, and Bahrain, Israel, UAE, and Bahrain, Israel deals, these are watershed developments for international relations with pretty significant implications for South Asian states with major interests and stakes in the Middle East. Now, in terms of Bangladesh, and I think this sort of gets into other issues of South Asia more broadly, I can sense significant implications for Bangladesh, not direct ones, just because Bangladesh doesn't have the types of deep, close relationships with countries in the Middle East that other South Asian states like India and Pakistan do. But what I think about is I talked before about how the Iran-Saudi rivalry could be exacerbated, leading to potentially more volatility in the Middle East region. Bangladesh, like many South Asian states, depends on remittances from many countries in the Middle East. We know that Bangladesh has a significant number of workers, particularly migrant laborers and workers that are based in the Arab Gulf region, including in some of the countries that have inked this deal with Israel. And also, Bangladesh does not depend on energy. It does not have energy interests in the Middle East like India and Pakistan do. But I think Bangladesh does look to the day when it could consider deepening energy ties with some of the oil-producing states or the hydrocarbon-producing states, governments of the Gulf. And if you have a heightened Saudi Arabia-Iran rivalry, thanks to the deal between the UAE and Israel and Bahrain and Israel and perhaps other countries aligned with Saudi Arabia signing deals with Israel, then that could have implications for Bangladesh, because Bangladesh has workers, it has nationals in the Middle East, and it also has it gets remittances from those workers in the Middle East. And because of its energy interest, its potential energy interest. I would not overstate Bangladesh's energy interest and their potential to be impacted or imperiled by these deals that Israel is signing.